Everyone, this is the November-December public forum demo debate on the November-December public forum topic. The topic is resolve the United States strategy of great power competition produces more benefits than harms. Speaking first on the affirmative will be Tejas Balaji and Caroline Waldman, and speaking second on the negative will be Srikar Satish and Conrad Poor. All right. Affirmative, particular one.
We affirm that NI-22 finds that cyber warfare is becoming an increasingly important tool in the great power competition. In response to Russian, Chinese, North Korean, and Iranian threats in the digital realm, US cyber operations have greatly expanded, and West 21 argues that conflict is now waged in the digital sphere. United States cyber operations are key for two reasons. Contention one is voter suppression. Russian misinformation in the 2016 election targeted Black voters. Bump 19 quantifies that over 2/3 of all Russian misinformation contained terms related to race. Bump further, the locational targeting of these ads was aimed at Black citizens in key metropolitan areas. This dramatically reduced turnout of Black voters. Riccardi writes 1.6 million Black voters who voted in 2012 didn't in 2016. The impact is dire. People who don't vote aren't represented, leading policymakers to ignore their needs. Rodriguez 15 writes, 1 in 3 deaths of Black people between 1970 and 2004 would have been prevented if they had equal access to education, healthcare, and public services as white people. Rodriguez writes, there's a range of problems that could be addressed by public policy, but this requires voting. If they voted at the same rate as white people, he quantifies that 1.6 million Black people would still be alive today. Offensive cyber operations protect voters who are Black from Russian attempts to suppress their votes in 2 ways. The first is by turning the power off. Bratberg 18 writes that most of Russia's efforts to reduce turnout of Black people occur on election day. Fortunately, Greenberg 19 writes that Cyber Command launched a cyber attack on Russia's Internet Research Agency on 2018 election day, preventing a last-minute flood of disinformation designed to decrease turnout. The second is by sliding into the DMs. Nakashima 18 writes, cyber operations help the US de-anonymize Russian hackers, allowing us to email, text, and digitally message threats to expose their identities. She concludes that the chilling effect that these operations allows the US to halt Russian disinformation campaigns without any physical damage whatsoever. Ultimately, Atkin 18 writes that Black voter turnout doubled in 2018. She concludes that US operations reduced misinformation and prevented Russia from, quote, producing a new Jim Crow. Our second contention is protecting our ships. Iran has increasingly been using their own offensive cyber attacks. As Abdul 19 writes, that Iran has increased its offensive cyber attacks against the US, and hackers working for the Iranian government have targeted sectors of the economy, including oil and gas, sending waves of spear phishing emails. These attacks have been aimed at commercial vessels. As Radio Farda 19 writes, that vessels operating in the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, and Gulf of Oman encounter GPS interference and communication jamming with no warning. Iran has interfered with the navigation systems of vessels to lure them into its airspace and territorial waters, and to give Iranian military forces a pretext to detain them. Thankfully, US offensive cyber ops prevent further attacks for 2 reasons. The first is deterrence. US cyber capabilities are key to credible deterrence. Liminal 12 writes that deterrence will only be effective if you can demonstrate offensive cyber capabilities. In the logic of deterrence, even more important than having the actual capability is the perception of having that capability. Pomerleau 19 finalizes, the pure threat of retaliation has prevented a serious cyber attack on critical infrastructure. Second is knocking them offline. Doffman 19 writes, the US digital strike targeted an Iranian spy group that supported tanker attacks, which have digitally tracked and targeted military and civilian ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. US cyber attacks serve to defend the United States Navy and shipping operations in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran then can't recover. Doffman 19 writes, US officials have told media that covert attacks on Iranian intelligence systems had such a devastating impact that the country has yet to recover its capabilities. Iran's ability to mount further attacks has, for the first time, been seriously degraded. The impact is a fiscal fiasco. Oil sheezers raise oil prices. As Dylan 19 writes, the price of oil jumped in aftermarket trading following the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps seizing an oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. And future oil disruptions are worse as they cause investor panic. Writing 19 writes that investors are jittery about retaliation by the US against Iran. Such an escalation would disrupt further oil supply and cause prices to spike. This produces economic disruptions. Keshner 19 writes, uncertainty in the oil market will make consumers nervous. Companies could also be cautious about making investments like expanding capacity and hiring more workers. Oil shocks will cause a quick financial crisis, as Wilson 19 writes that the world economy cannot sustain high prices of oil without collapsing. That in turn causes mass poverty. Bradford 13 writes that 900 million people could fall back into poverty in the event of an economic shock like the Great Recession. Thus, we affirm.
Let's begin. We negate the resolution. Contention 1 is nuclear holocaust. The US politics of great power competition has fueled a proxy war with Russia and the Ukraine. Davis in August 1st writes that the return of great power competition in Europe masks true great power competition. The United States and Russia are preoccupied fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. In fact, great power competition is the root of the conflict. 1022 continues. The root of current tensions between Moscow and Washington is pursuing a containment strategy in the discourse of the Cold War era, incessantly tied to put Russia and Ukraine in confrontation with each other. When the flame of the war ignited, NATO started sending heavy and semi-heavy military equipment to Ukraine from its two active and up-to-date command centers in America and Germany, and an unbelievable speed and trapped Putin and the Russian army in a deep quagmire. This strategy puts the world at risk of a nuclear holocaust and nuclear escalation. Mearsheimer 22. The West, and especially America, is principally responsible for the crisis that not only threatens to destroy Ukraine, but also has the power to escalate to a nuclear war between Russia and NATO. America ignored Moscow's red line, however, and pushed forward to make Ukraine a Western bulk war on Russia's border. The Trump administration decided to sell Kyiv defensive weapons. These weapons certainly looked offensive to Moscow and its allies in the Donbass region. Other NATO countries got into the act, shipping weapons to the Ukraine. We are in an extremely dangerous situation. Western policy is exacerbating these risks. American and its allies are doubling down. There's a serious threat of escalation beyond Ukraine, not to mention the danger of nuclear war. The risk of nuclear escalation in the Ukraine is super high at the moment and proves that the harms of great power competition outweigh the benefits. First, according to Reuters on September 30th, NATO has upped the ante in response to Putin's nuclear threat. It writes, NATO accused Putin of provoking the most serious escalation of the war in Ukraine since it began. We have the combination of mobilization in Russia combined with the dangerous, reckless nuclear rhetoric. Second, massive Russian conventional force losses have increased the risk that Russia will resort to nuclear weapon use. Lawler writes on October 1st, Putin's nuclear threats are growing more direct as battlefield position grows more precarious. An NSA advisor Jake Sullivan conceded, given all these looks and talks of nuclear saber rattling by Putin, that he would consider this. Putin said the US itself has set a precedent for the use of nuclear weapons when it bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Checks that normally prevent a nuclear war also no longer exist. Levin writes on September 30th, direct talks between Ukraine and Russia are now so difficult. If escalation continues unchecked, the prospect of direct nuclear conflict between America and Russia will become an active possibility. The impact of nuclear war is ending civilization. Abolition 22 writes, the nuclear conflict between the US, NATO, and Russia would be civilization ending, and not merely because the target of any large number of cities would cause firestorms that would loft approximately 150 million tons of soot into the upper stratosphere, replacing global warming temporarily with nuclear winter. A nuclear conflict, even if stopped, would be with the use of only a very small number of nuclear weapons, and even if it targeted no cities at all, if it took place, could potentially destroy telecommunications in the world at writ large. Contention 2 is the collapse of the liberal world order. Currently, we live in a US unipolar world. The question is not a US order versus others. The US intrinsically will lose. The question is about transition. Affirming and clinging towards great power competition leads to war. The era of US unipolarity is over. COVID accelerated the decline. Cooley 20 writes, COVID-19 accelerated the erosion of US hegemony. China increased its influence in the WHO in the wake of the Trump administration, amongst other actors like Russia. This era of American exceptionalism is over. COVID hastened the great power transition from the US to China. Davis 20 writes, COVID has reduced the illusion of American exceptionalism ruled by dysfunctional government, responsible for deaths, added a tragic coda to America's supremacy. Scenario 1 is transition war. Porter 19 writes, even the US cannot take on multiple fronts. Mobilization for dominance and risk escalation would overstretch the country. The defense budget approaches $800 billion. Growing debt poses substantial risk. Mazur 16 furthers, China and Russia feel disenfranchised by a US-dominated system. Both have called for reforms to make the order less imperial. If Washington hopes to sustain an international system that can avoid conflict, it will have to embrace a more diverse order. Galen 19 furthers, willingness of Western powers to accept Russia or Russia's influence would solve current problems in relations and markedly reduce tension, proving that not having great power competition is a key to peace across the world. For that reason, I strongly urge a vote for the negative. Now, would you like the first question?
Sure. So can you briefly walk me through the history of conflict between Ukraine and Russia?
Sure. So in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, and our argument is that Ukraine is viewed by Russia as a border to the west. It's because of the U.S. continual military expansion across the region through the usage of military bases across the world, U.S. naval fleet, that Russia annexed Crimea, that the U.S. put sanctions on in 2014, that exacerbated the conflict with Russia and Syria, the Middle East, and only furthered and led to the situation we're today, where Russia is expansionary as a result of U.S. A desire to maintain great power competition.
Great. I mean, further back than that, like, why are Ukraine and Russia different countries in the first place?
We think there's maybe ethnic ties, but I'm going to take a question now.
Okay.
So let's talk about your first contention where you talk about the cyber warfare. So let's just, I guess, take a step back. Does the US currently pursue a policy of great power competition?
Probably that's the resolution, but
Yeah.
our evidence says that
So,
they're pursuing cyber instead of something like traditional conflict.
so if they pursue, okay, so you say that they pursue cyber instead of traditional conflict. So you would say traditional conflict, that wouldn't be great power competition?
No, we'd say it probably still counts, but our West evidence is pretty explicit in saying that conflict is now turning toward the digital realm
So
within the.
even so even in this digital realm,
Can I take a question?
in 2016, like all of your evidence, I guess my question is, if great power competition exists, and you talk about how voters have been disenfranchised historically, why is that unique to great power competition? Great power competition didn't solve 2016 Russian interference.
Yeah, here, I can explain our contention for you a little bit. So what we tell you is that Russia is attempting to suppress voters in the US in an attempt to like undermine our democracy. They mostly target Black voters because they view them as a homogenous voting group, especially in
But
metropolitan
if we're
areas.
pursuing great power competition, how does great power competition solve?
Yeah, I can finish and then that'll answer your question. So our West evidence is really clear. Within the great power competition, the US is going digital. And then that's what our like Riccardi evidence and our Rodriguez evidence is about. Like within the digital sphere, the US is stopping Russia from doing things like what our contention is about, intervening in elections.
How does solving Russia, so in terms of your impact, how does solving Russian interference solve for systemic inequities within the US election system, ranging from gerrymandering to the electoral college? How does that protect Black voters?
The really important thing about voting is that it allows you to shape policy, especially at a local level.
How does that matter if you're in a gerrymandered district and your vote doesn't?
Yeah, so here's the thing though, that district is gerrymandered for a reason. Our Rodriguez evidence is like super explicit. It says verbatim that if people voted like at equal rates across the board, 1/3 of deaths of Black people would be prevented because at a local level, policy is shaping towards your needs.
At the top, all of their arguments are about conventional conflict. We say that the US's great power competition strategy is why none of their impacts will manifest. That's because everything's going cyber right now. Because the US is doing all of their great power competition on the cyber level, there isn't going to be conventional conflict that will result in nuke war impacts that they talk about. You prefer this argument on probability for two reasons. A, none of their conventional war impacts have actually manifested into nuke war yet. They don't tell you when that's going to happen. And B, they read impacts right now that says that conventional war is decreasing and it's increasing into cyber. We say that that's our case. However, this doesn't happen if you negate and the US doesn't use great power competition. The reason for that is simple. Their evidence tells you that Russia is using conventional conflict right now, meaning that if the US wasn't using great power competition strategy, then countries like Russia and China would go towards conventional warfare and war would go nuclear. With that being said, let's go to their first contention about nuclear war. Firstly, they talk about Russia and Ukraine conflict, but their evidence is really bad because what they talk about, what they say is that NATO is essentially giving artillery to Ukraine and they're escalating the conflict. However, we tell you that the conflict only started because of Russia in the first place. Russia was the one who attacked Ukraine to begin with. Russia is the one that's sanctioning a lot of regions in Ukraine without any consent and invading the country. NATO has to respond because if NATO and the US doesn't respond, then Russia will A, increase its expansionary policy in a bunch of different countries, increasing conflict. And B, the worst part of it is that other countries that the US is allies with will proliferate if the US doesn't take action against Russia. This is really, really problematic because when proliferation goes up, that increases the chances for nuclear miscalculation, which is a better link into their impact. You prefer us on probability because this hasn't happened yet because the US great competition strategies are still being used. They might come up here and tell you that we're escalating, but that doesn't really make any sense because A, their evidence tells you that NATO only started giving artillery to Ukraine after Russia invaded the country in the first place. But secondly, they read this evidence that says that the US set the precedent for nuclear war after World War II, meaning that no matter what we do, Russia's always going to have something to scapegoat the US for and will always have a justification for its expansionary policies. With that being said, let's go to their second contention about liberal world order collapse. At the top, they say that the US's unipolar power is decreasing. That's just patently false. The reason for this is very simple. COVID affected China more negatively than it did us. That's because A, not only did the same economic impacts apply to countries like Russia and China, but B, because COVID started in China, their soft power decreased significantly because of COVID. At that point, if anything, the argument swings towards our side, because the US, for example, distributed vaccines worldwide, which increased our soft power. If anything, COVID is the reason as to why the US's unipolarity will be cemented and will continue for decades forward. The only way this doesn't happen is if we didn't use our great power competition strategies. But then, secondly, our proliferation turn applies here too, because even if their argument was true, countries like Japan and other allies that we have will never accept countries like Russia or China, especially because they have been imperialistic and have been invading other countries. They're never going to trust these other countries. So even if we stop doing anything, that doesn't mean that every other country is just going to peacefully accept a country like China to become the unipolar power, which means that if anything, their argument will increase the likelihood of nuclear war. But then thirdly, their own evidence contradicts their link. They first say that China is going to become the unipolar power. But then secondly, they say that, oh, we should accept Russian influences. Which one is it, China or Russia? We say that because of the fact that both China and Russia are increasing their power right now, that means that unipolarity isn't possible, even if the US can't be the main power anymore. Meaning that if the US wasn't involved, then this conflict would just become Russia versus China with no Western power deterring either of them, which would again increase the chances of nuclear war. At that point, the only way that you prevent conventional warfare from happening is by continuing cyber policy that we're doing right now. Again, preferred on probability. You haven't seen any of their impacts manifest yet. For those reasons, we're very proud to affirm.
Okay, I guess I can start then. Let me just put this on. This round's going to come down to actor incentive. If we prove that escalatory measures are going to happen, those escalatory measures can still happen in retaliation in forms of cyber, which means that this round is going to be coming down to the idea of deterrence versus escalation. They have not read a single piece of evidence contesting the idea of deterrence. They just give you empirical examples that are also probably going to go towards us. They give you this argument about Russia and Ukraine. They don't look at the history. In September 13th, we decided to put a base inside of Ukraine, and then Russia attacked. And Russia's big thing was they don't want troops in Ukraine, and we started doing joint military drills. It's always been that. That's why they invaded Crimea, and that's why they invaded now again. They read this prolif probability. No, we haven't seen any prolif in like Eastern Europe at all. This probability is like probably really, really low, and C1 doesn't really matter either way. Let's go to C2. You could group their first response and their third response. They have completely missed every single warrant to be given this idea. They just talk about COVID, but they ignore the other two. The first one we're going to go for is bizarre. That says because the United States is becoming so imperialist, i.e. they just go to the Middle East and bomb whatever they want. They just put troops wherever they want, expect to do whatever. That caused Russia and China to expand together. That's why they are doing joint military drills against the United States. And that's the reason why U.S. unipolar power is gone. The second warrant is also going to be coming from the Peter card that specifically says that soft power with America is caused death. This is because of the America first rhetoric that has been produced, and that's why almost no country trusts the United States. More and more people are going to sign on to China and other places. They read this like prolif dissad from like South Korea and Japan. One, they've conceded our evidence that if we go in a peaceful manner and we don't cling to hegemony, we can go towards more cooperative measures. And if that happens, that means that people are going to cooperate, i.e. South Korea and Japan just do whatever the United States wants. So if we go and cooperate with China, they would too. On the top of the F, quick weighing overview, we would say that scope has to come before probability. We're policymakers. On a technical level, probability should be if you win the links on the flow. If we win the link on the flow, that means it's probable. That's the only way to not have judge intervention. And cognitive bias means we ignore these high scope impacts. That's more important. The second thing is going to be on uniqueness. They themselves tell you that we have great power competition right now. This means that every single statistic they give you are harms of great power competition, i.e. the 1.6 million people they talk about in their first contention is reasons why great power competition is bad. The reason why Russia is even expanding is because of great power competition. In fact, Davis 19 finds the underlying crisis of legitimacy and authority is almost impossible to solve because the power of the United States imperialism and the rule of law, meaning that every single issue can be solved in terms of IR if we go and we just don't have this United States imperialism. On their C1 specifically, first, we would say that they don't talk about the actor incentive. The reason why Russia even goes and does this sort of voter suppression is because they're enfranchised with U.S. order. That's the master evidence that they have conceded, which means it's game over on that front. But secondly, we would say deterrence actually causes more people to go and lash out. This is because the United States often does offensive cyber operations like they talk about in their C2 that go into Russia's grid, which cause Putin to get even more upset, and they do retaliatory measures against the United States. That's the reason why voter suppression happens in the first place. But On C2, you can basically group C1 and C2. All these responses will apply. First, you could turn it. Mock in 2018 finds that NASA outsourced its capabilities to the private sector and created a cyber industrial complex. This is bad because the cyber industrial complex justifies infinite escalation because that's how they get money. This means that as long as you have this like profit incentive for a great power conflict that causes people to go and rush for more and more cyber capabilities, there's always going to be cyber attacks on both sides, which outweighs on scope as well, because that means there's going to be voter suppression, not only in the United States, but all over the globe. But also, we would say that a D-Link, because Mackenzie 17 explains that there's an inability to attribute most offensive cyber capabilities, which means there can't even be deterrence, even if you have offensive cyber capabilities. A good example of this is Stuxnet. We went and we attacked Iran with a cyber attack, but nobody knew it was us until we came out and said we did it, which is why it is impossible to do that. There's tons of cyber attacks. We don't know if any of them happen. Also, every single harm they give you in their case are reasons to vote con, because great power competition is right now.
All right, cross.
Yeah, you can have the first question.
Thanks. So you say over on your case, right, that like we built a base or something in Ukraine. Why is us building like one base a good enough justification for Russia to like continue a war for over a year and then like most recently annex like 6 different territories?
Sure, I got you. It's because Russia's entire grand scheme is about NATO expansion. If you look at the map of Russia, actually, there's a book by me that specifically talks about like how it is the Middle East is basically, they have Turkey there, right? There's NATO there. This side, there's Japan. So Russia's like encircled, right? The only like, I guess, form of strategic leverage they have is that, hey, if you do something, we could invade Ukraine. But when the United States start putting troops in there, that gives the signal that, hey, they're eventually going to join NATO. They're basically going to be a US ally. So Russia needed to attack before that happens. And that's the reason that September 13th incident was so important.
Speaker, really quickly though, right? Over the time and over the course of this like war with Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine has become closer and closer to the West, simply by virtue of the fact that Russia continued to be on the offensive. And Putin was well aware of this. However, he
wait. You can't just assume that Putin's well aware of that.
Obviously, Putin's aware of it because if I'm aware of it, he is too. Obviously,
well,
Zelensky
you're talking after the fact. You're talking after the fact.
Wait, just let me finish my question, right? It is, I think it's like pretty clear that Ukraine and the West have become closer and closer because of the war, simply because of the fact that they've had to like cooperate with each other against Russia, mostly because Russia's been on the offensive. At that point, is it really fair to say that Russia is doing this because, oh, they're so scared and they're so like defensive and they don't want Ukraine to become allied with the West? Or is it more fair to say that Russia wants to be on the offensive and wants to increase their influence?
So the answer, with all the evidence, for example, Mazar, that you conceded, is going to be the former. The reason why is because they've been encircled on all fronts. This is like try or die for them. They're going to continue this war until they get out of Ukraine. But that's been a minute 30. I'm going to have a question now. I'm going to take a question now. So let's move to your C1, for example, right? What's the like Russia doesn't want to like intentionally like trigger everybody, right? Or would you say they want to?
I would say that Russia is an imperialist country that wants to spread its influence, and I don't think building one base means that they're like encircled. I don't know what you mean.
That's not answering my question.
I don't know what you mean by Russia wants to trigger everybody. Like I don't know.
So I guess the question is, what is like the incentive for Russia doing voter suppression?
I just told you, Russia wants to become the hegemon. Russia wants.
Why are they only doing against the U.S.? Like, where else are they doing? Like,
because the U.S. is the world hegemon right now.
Yeah, so because the U.S. is the world hegemon, Russia attacks them. That's exactly what our Mazar
evidence says. You're conceding that Russia wants to spread its influence. A country that is defensive doesn't care about being the world hegemon. You have conceded that Russia wants to be the world hegemon.
I think you're misunderstanding our analysis. The point of this question and the point that you just made is that they only attack the U.S. is because they think the U.S. is imperialist.
That's they don't only attack the U.S., they also attack Ukraine. And I don't think it's fair to say that they only attack the U.S. because they think the U.S. is imperialist. I don't think targeting black voters
that's the evidence that you conceded in states. Either way, that's over time, but that's the evidence that you conceded in states.
I'm going to start on the neg, and then I'll go to the off. They dropped Tejas's overview. Remember what he tells you, that all of their arguments are about conventional conflict, but the US strategy is the thing that is making the global conflict turn to cyber right now. But if the US stops our offensive strategy in terms of the great power competition, that means that Russia and China are going to return towards conventional methods of conflict. That on net means their impacts are more likely to happen, and we'd say that's probably worse in terms of like ending civilization or whatever their impact is. But then on the link level, we tell you that Russia only invaded Ukraine, or they try and tell you that Russia only invaded Ukraine because of NATO, but there are two problems with that. One, Ukraine isn't a part of NATO, but two, their only piece of evidence saying that the US is involved in Ukraine is saying that we built like one military base there. We'd say that's not enough for Russia to like literally go to war. Obviously, they're doing it because they want to expand. Both Tejas and Shrikar agree on that in Cross. That's where we tell you that you're extending our turnabout ally proliferation, because if the US was not taking action, our allies would feel the need to protect themselves. They would increase their probability of nuclear miscalculation. You prefer some probability. Our allies are literally going to escalate if they can't believe that we're going to protect them. But that also means that like you're turning their impact, because a nuclear winter is way more likely to happen if tons of countries that used to be reliant on our protection are now escalating their nuclear capabilities, and they're going to be way more likely to miscalculate. But then on their second contention, they dropped the turn about COVID. That's most important. Their evidence might have been true before COVID, but remember what Tejas tells you, that A, COVID started in China. That means there's been a massive decrease in their soft power, but B, the US was the one who came up with the vaccine and distributed it to the world. That means countries are turning to us to lead them. Then they try and tell you that the countries, that Russia and China are banding together to fight against the US. But remember what Tejas tells you, that the US is the only one keeping Russia and China from going towards conventional methods of conflict. The US is the one keeping the conflict in the cyber realm mostly, but without the US, an all-out war is way more likely. They try and tell you that Russia and China are like going to work together. But remember what we agree on in Cross, that Russia wants to become the hegemon, and they're always looking for a way to scapegoat the US. They are inherently expansionary. They're not going to stop if the US suddenly pulls out. They're just going to go to war against China. Then on our case, they say that escalation happens after cyber attacks. That's empirically proven false. Our evidence also says it didn't happen. Then we're extending our West 21 card that tells you that the conflict is now going digital. We all agree that Russia wants to become the hegemon. Like, we both agreed on this in Cross, which is why they've targeted voter systems across the world, but the US has been able to stop them from suppressing Black voters within our own country. That's really good, because our Rodriguez evidence tells us that 1.6 million lives have been saved through equal access to the things that like education and hospitals and stuff that is shaped by your local elections. They tell you that cyber attacks are anonymous. Great, that delinks their overview about retaliation happening. But then on our second contention, they mishandle it. It's not about Russia, it's about Iran. We're extending our second link about knocking people offline. Our Doffman evidence tells us that the US knocked Iranian hackers offline and that the country hasn't been able to recover. That then we're extending our impact of the financial fiasco. The US stops the financial crisis. It prevented 9 million people from going into poverty. You prefer this because A, it's the largest impact, but B, on probability. One, they dropped the link completely, so we're winning under their definition of probability, but two, their impacts have no timeline and they should have already been triggered. We'd say they're only worse in their world, but our impacts are really clear. Our evidence is empirical. They've been stopped in the past.
All right, so as a brief overview, it's going to start with Wang and then go to the negative case and then the affirmative case. Let's begin. The most important impact in the round is a nuclear holocaust. This extinction outweighs their only impact about poverty. This is true for two reasons. First, magnitude. The Abolition 22 evidence explicates specifically that even the minor use of tactical nuclear weapons in the Ukraine could cause nuclear war and a nuclear holocaust, resulting in full extinction. Extinction outweighs. Extinction is an infinite impact, which outweighs their arguments on scope. They only impacted 900 million people. And B, even if nuclear holocaust doesn't cause full extinction, it would cause their impacts to happen, showing that's a prerequisite. Also on time frame, it outweighs. The Reuters 22 evidence explains is that due to tactical losses in Ukraine, Russia is uniquely posed to use nuclear weapons. Here's how that functions in the debate. They've dropped the Mazar evidence, which is the best piece of root cause evidence in the round. The Mazar 22 evidence explains is that the root cause of both China and Russia expansionism is the United States and the policy of great power competition. This is a big distinction. They say that Russia and China are hegemons, that they will fight each other absent the United States. That couldn't be anything further from the truth. Their argument is that they're regional hegemons, and the only reason as to why they're expansionary in their respective regions is because of the US policy of great power competition. This was cleanly dropped evidence. evidence. They've also dropped evidence from Davis 22 explains that the Ukraine example is a classic example of great power competition failing and Russia's response to the United States. This answers their argument that they say that Russia doesn't care about military base because this is warranted evidence. They don't have any evidence in response. And also, it's not just one base in Ukraine. The United States also has bases across all of Western Europe. And our arguments about NATO expansionism more generally, not just the United States. And we also say that they also have military bases in Turkey. It's literally containing Russia that's causing escalation. They also haven't read good deterrence evidence in the debate. Now, on the line by line, they say that the SCO is cyber. That's empirically disproven by the war in Ukraine. Russia is using conventional warfare, empirically disproven, and that causes the nuclear escalation conflict that we talk about. They also say COVID started in China. That doesn't matter. And they say that the United States controls United States soft power as a result of the distribution of the vaccine. This is turned by the Petters evidence, which indicates that U.S. use of soft power is the root cause of these countries becoming expansionary because they hate the U.S. use of soft power and the contradictions they have with the U.S. military expansion across the world. This answers all of their cards here. Now let's go to their case. A couple of turns you're going to extend. First, they dropped the evidence that we read in the last speech from the fact that the Manus 15 evidence, the cyber industrial complex, specifically how the United States has outsourced their use of cybersecurity to private vendors, and the profit incentive articulated by Streetcar explains that this will result in escalation in war. This proves that at the point in which the United States is the cause of Russia's cyber attacks in the first place, and the fact that these profit incentives by private companies within the United States means that there will be a never-ending warfare, means we turn their impact. Specifically, their only link they extended is the Iranian hackers. Again, the U.S. is the root cause as to why U.S. politics of great power competition is why Iran is hacking the U.S. in the first place, and the use of private military or private cybersecurity experts is an escalatory measure that will escalate the conflict, means we have a link turn into their only impact. But regardless, the nuclear war scenario specific to Ukraine outweighs, and that's the reason why you should be voting for us.
Take it.
Sure. Okay, let's talk about the cyber industrial complex. How is that different from the military industrial complex?
It's specific to cyber. So the idea is that cyber warfare has been generally like limited in the sense that like cyber warfare has not been like if it's part of the great power prior to great power competition strategy with cyber. Prior to that, it like wasn't included. But then when exactly what you talked about, great power competition started including cyber, we started putting the private sector in cyber warfare, and we started having them. We started contracting PMCs and all this other stuff, and that's why there's been a lot of escalation in cyber attacks. So that's why the uniqueness evidence on your side proves our argument.
Okay, so you talk about this escalation happening after cyber attacks a couple of times, but I don't think you have any examples of it ever. What's
in rebuttal, I give, well, I guess every single example you give in case is an example, right? All these Iranian cyber attacks are predated by stuff.
Also, the measure is evidence is from 2022. So like the examples are forthcoming. It's a recent phenomenon. The U.S. has outsourced these the use of cyber professionals.
Okay, so we're just like waiting for them to get mad enough at cyber attacks to retaliate.
No, we're saying that there is a constant cyber attack or cyber back and forth between the United States and other countries in the first place, and due to the profit incentive of these cyber companies, that's only going to continue in the future.
Okay, so like when are we going to see this impact happen then of cyber?
I'd say like I would say like we will see a really big scale cyber attack happening soon, but I would say the attacks by Iran. What?
Do you have evidence saying that we're going to see a big cyber attack happen soon? Because our evidence is pretty clear. When the US was doing cyber ops in 2016 and then 2018, there was no retaliation. So what y'all are telling me now is something unique has happened. Do you mind if I finish? Is that something unique has happened within the past like 5 months that means that retaliation is suddenly like on the brink of happening? I want to know if you have evidence for that, and I want to know who that retaliation is coming from, what it might look like, because right now it's just
taking a step back and just saying like all the examples you use about Russia interference in the U.S. or really anything, or is all the result of great power competition. So I think just winning the root cause argument means we kind of short circuit this whole debate. Can we ask a question?
Go for it.
Okay, so on your argument about in response to our nuclear holocaust contention, you talk about how the United States currently, or that we only have like one military base, and that's not enough to provoke Russia. What counter evidence did you read in the debate that indicates that Russia has alternative motives for going into the war besides the fact that it was responding to the U.S. and NATO expansion?
There's a little more nuance there. So what you guys tell us is that NATO's existence is what provoked Russia into attacking Ukraine, but we tell you there's two issues with that. One, Ukraine's not a part of NATO, so it doesn't make sense. But two, if we're going to say that the US's influence in the region is what's making Russia angry, then the influence in the region in question is one military base, which is, we'd say, probably not enough for Putin to justify an entire war.
Well, it's joint military drills plus more, but yeah.
Time starts now. Let's start on their case. For them to win their argument, they need to prove that we are encircling Russia, and that's why they've started the war in Ukraine. This isn't true. The only substantive evidence they have in case is this idea that we have like one base in the Ukraine and that we've done joint military drills. Well, Russia isn't attacking that base specifically, isn't attacking those drills specifically. He started a war against the Ukraine for over a year and has annexed 6 different regions just last month. This isn't attacking specific bases. This is all-out military domination on part of Russia. There's no way they're winning their argument. They've also conceded every single response Caroline made in the last speech. Number one, Ukraine isn't even in NATO to begin with. Number two, Russia is also attacking black voters within the US, which is completely imperialist and has literally nothing to do with the US encircling Russia, proving our argument again to be true. And number three, we would say that they've conceded our pro-lift disad as well. But before I get into that, as long as they aren't winning this encircling argument, they have zero link into their case. At that point, they've also conceded the pro-lift disad. We tell you very clearly that if the US backs off and doesn't protect its allies anymore, those allies aren't under the nuclear umbrella of the US anymore. At that point, they'll feel that they need to take matters into their own hand to protect themselves against their enemies. This results in nuclear proliferation, which increases the chances of miscalculation. This argument has not been responded to at all. At that point, we have a better link into their weighing and their impact about nuclear war than they do. But even on their impact of nuclear war, as long as our argument is true, they're not accessing the link because we're making everything cyber. Even if their argument about cyber competition is true, it's still better than conventional conflict because it doesn't go nuclear. Even if Russia's doing conventional, the US will only respond with cyber. At that point, let's go over to our case. They answer the wrong link. Our argument is that Iran is attacking the Strait of Hormuz right now, not the US. That's going to cause 900 million people to go into poverty because of oil disruptions, but luckily we've been knocking Iran hackers offline through our Great War competition strategies. At that point, A, that proves that other actors are being escalatory because that has nothing to do with the US starting the attacks, and B, it means that none of their answers touch our link. We also outweigh on clarity of link. For those reasons, we are very, very proud to affirm.
Okay, cool. It's good to start on the neg case and then go to the AF case. Everyone good? This round is simple. They have conceded that nuclear weapons and nuclear war is the most important impact because of extinction. Their C2 doesn't even matter. Plus, there's no link extension on it. Let's go to our case. This round is over when they concede Mazar. They say one substantive base, but they ignore literally 5 pieces of evidence. Mazar is really good. It says that because Russia and China are encircled by the United States, and because the United States is being imperialist with their power, these people are doing joint military drills to fight against the United States. This isn't just one base. This is like the entirety, the last like 20 years of history. This is really important because the distinction that is made is that U.S. unipolarity is destined to fail. The question is not when Russia will expand, but it is how. In our world, Russia, without great power competition, you have regional hegemony. You don't have global hegemony where you have massive wars occurring, but in their world, that's what's going to happen. That also means that our argument is kind of non-unique. Let's extend the link. Our argument states that the best example of great power competition through Davis is that Russia is responding to NATO expansionism, and that's because of great power competition. This could lead to a nuclear weapon because a nuclear weapon is most likely to be used. That's the Abolition 22 evidence, and that nuclear weapon could lead to extinction. That has been conceded as well. They have also conceded the time frame evidence, which also frames out their argument from Reuters 22 that says that indicates that tactical nukes in Russia uniquely likely due to the lost ground inside of Russia. this is really easy. Maybe this pro-lift disad. One, the Mazar evidence, again, frontlines this. If we give up our power slightly, this isn't exactly abandonment of the allies. This is just us maintaining some sort of power. If you care about U.S. power, you vote neg. Let's go in their case. They say it's the wrong link. They concede the disad. It says that when you have great power competition, that means you increase the influence of cyber industrial conflicts. That means that you're going to be hacking everybody. If you care about hacking being bad, this is the disad that always on scope because this means that there's going to be infinite form of escalation, not just from Iran. This means that Russia's going to escalate, which leads to the same impact on case. It's going to mean that China's going to escalate, same impact on case. You have like their entire scenario happening 10 billion times, which are going to be probably a bigger impact than anything they could say. I guess also because just Mazar supported, time frame supported, and they've conceded the root cause analysis from that, we control the weighing level of this debate, which also frames out their link.
Great round.
Yeah, thank y'all.
Yeah.